what strengthens my grasp on the power?
The Middle Eastern countries, they're implicitly supporting Israel.
Everyone makes assumptions about what a Trump presidency could look like.
We have 50% of the American population that doesn't even have a pension.
You're going to do exactly the same thing.
There's massive privacy issues.
You don't want to be invested in any asset class.
It is not acceptable in a democratic society.
So now you're thinking in a multi-dimensional space.
It's just not translating.
Empirically, it's false that small guys can't win.
What's your take on this?
In my lifetime, India is unable to catch up with China.
It is all focused on the Pacific.
We're all subject to behavioral biases when we're investing.
80% of the loans is originated by shadow banking.
US needs cheap import from China.
The rate at which you're making money has to keep going up, otherwise your stock price goes down. It's insanity.
Germany's economic model was to import cheap Russian energy, use that to do some clever manufacturing, and then export out to China, to simplify the model here. What's happened now is that they don't have that cost advantage on the energy side because they've had to switch away from cheap Russian energy. Instead, they're importing much more expensive US, Qatar, and Australian LNG. They've had to build terminals and so on, so that the cost of energy production has gone up. And then more generally, exports to China have gone down. That's partly because China is manufacturing a lot of stuff themselves. And in fact, China has become a huge car exporter. But also what you're seeing is German companies themselves are shifting production facilities to China.
Aging and thinking about, well, what strengthens my grasp on the power, right? What strengthens legitimacy, make it easier for me to have more control. If sort of Taiwan declares independence and they kind of go, okay, well, we're too weak and the US supports that. And so there's nothing I can do, right? So they cannot be viewed as sort of weak. And so they have to have a credible threat in saying, look, if you declare independence, right, some very, very horrible things is going to happen to you. And it just doesn't matter what the US says. So we're willing to go to extreme pain and self-harming to make it so painful that you don't do it, right? That's like the only thing they have to do because it's the only unacceptable outcome. If they if they integrate Taiwan, does that strengthen their legitimacy? No, because I'm sure the integration is costly, expensive, it's fraught with challenge, it unmasks, the incompatibility between a democracy and a one-party state, right? I mean, it's much messier.
If you're a war planner in Beijing who's been given the job of looking at the mission that we know that the PLA has been given of being able to take Taiwan, again, doesn't mean they will, but they have to be able to and ready to as their mission. You'll be looking at these factors all the time. There may come a point where they say, well, actually, we're not particularly ready to go, but the US is in disarray, Europe's in disarray, we're getting the green light from a few people that they wouldn't mind if it happened now. We've got options, we're sanction-proofed. But if we leave it a few years, the US will be more ready. They'll have their carrier groups maybe repositioned. They'll have new and improved weapon systems. They can counter some of our weapon systems. So our time of comparative advantage is now. And then you get the argument that if we don't go to war now, we might never be able to, and we'll lose that lever of power.
It's just empirically, it's false that small guys can't win. They absolutely can. If you're 10, 20, 40, 50 billion of AUM, almost all of the horsepower that you have is going into sort of maintaining a mediocre Sharp, because otherwise you're so big that you can't even maintain a mediocre Sharp. So all your fancy data sets, all your fancy execution capabilities, all your PhDs, and your product is like a one Sharp.
With the ongoing bombardment by Israel on Palestine in Gaza, that support has started to go away. If you look at polling across the world, and it's started to fracture international alliance. So if you look at recent UN votes, it's really the US alone that keeps vetoing everything. The Middle Eastern countries like Egypt, Saudi, at the top level, they're kind of implicitly supporting Israel. They kind of have an economic relationship, but the people on the street are clearly on the Palestinian side. So if you have some change at the top, I mean, suddenly it opens up the whole region in a way that we didn't expect before.
The one objection, that I make to myself and to my pitch about hedge funds is, if you believe that the world is going to be a very difficult place, financial markets-wise, you don't want to be invested in any asset class, basically. In my experience as an investor, making money with falling markets is very, very, very difficult. And also, it's even more difficult to realize these gains, even if you manage to make money on the short side. it's incredibly difficult to sell these investments at the right time.
If everyone moves to a CBDC and a cashless society, then suddenly the government has the ability to impose negative interest rates. They may feel that your diet is not good enough and you should be only having healthy food. They could technically alter the CBDC to use specifically so you can only buy things from certain shops. There's massive privacy issues.
In the US already, 80% of the loans is originated by shadow banking, not by regulated banks. By the way, by shadow banking, I mean fintech platforms, I mean asset-based securities, warehouse facilities, funds, asset managers, right? So in the US, what I'm describing is kind of happening already.
The problem I have with the whole Trump thing is I think everyone makes assumptions about what we think a Trump presidency could look like. And actually, I think the reality is just no one knows. Because I think his policies can change very dramatically depending on who he's been influenced by recently or anything else. And we've seen that. We've seen a big change course on Ukraine compared to what he said, but I can see that flipping back again. And this is what worries me in the miscalculation space, because people might make assumptions about Trump's pathway or his views on something and then press the button on an action that they think the US won't contest. And the US contests it.
The Republicans certainly who've been through London recently, the senior ones, Pompeo and Colby and Pottinger, all auditioning for jobs in a Trump administration, of course. But when you ask them about Russia or you ask them what Trump will do about Iran, they turn immediately back to China. That is far more important for them as to how tougher Trump is likely to be on China than he was in the past. But it is all focused on the Pacific.
Let's take two countries, India and China, the biggest countries. Let's assume they're growing at the same rate. India has always grown less than China. But India's population growth rate has been more than double, sometimes even 3 times that of China. So if the numerator is the same, GDP growth of two countries, but the population growth of India is double, India's GDP per capita growth staggers relative to China. And I've made statements in my own country, India, saying, in my lifetime, India is unable to catch up with China, irrespective of what you think.
So as these processes are taking place, this is where we get a chance to say, what did we get wrong? America is going through the same crisis. We have 50% of the American population that doesn't even have a pension. So if people are borrowing at high levels of interest rate to make their daily payments, and now you force them to auto-enroll in Nest and they get a 4% return on their investments, that's a terrible thing because you made them poorer.
Hugo, I think we have one of the highest Reform UK shares, and at the minute, it's just not translating down to the ballot box. We're just not seeing a party that is at sort of 16% or whatever it is in the polls, going out there and winning council seats or winning or pushing really hard in by-elections, which is, of course, what UKIP did in the sort of the 2013 to 2016 era. They put on some really impressive performances. They were winning, 100 councillors in local authority elections. Reform UK in the most recent ones just won 2. If the Reform UK are going to really compete in some constituencies or really going to start returning some MPs, we need to be seeing them on 30, 35, 40% in some constituencies. And we're just not seeing that.
You cannot have an unelected bureaucrat sitting in the Bank of England regulate the behavior or the conduct of the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Prime Minister. It is not acceptable in a democratic society because the central bank ultimately is a non-democratic institution. But if the roots of the crisis or the biggest problems are caused by the politicians, then it's an unregulatable type of behavior. So what you end up is the Bank of England and the other macro-pro authorities regulating what they can regulate, but because they have to leave out the biggest risk factors, it's a very big ingredient in my illusion of control.
If you are elected, you are fighting for the median voter, and the median voter is exactly the person you want to take care of, and therefore you don't want him to go bankrupt. Therefore, you're going to do exactly the same thing, exactly because, not despite, exactly because you are an elected official.
The guy sitting by himself can also make a 1 sharp, right? Now, he can't make that 1 sharp on 50 billion. So they are different things. But in terms of the actual quality of returns and the risk-adjusted returns, they're not that different. There's a sweet spot in between on the size dimension. And depending on the asset class you're trading, I think that's somewhere around, and I know this is going to sound big because it's 1 order of magnitude difference, but in the scheme of all AUMs, It's actually a pretty narrow window of about 500 million to about 5 billion.
The proliferation of AI is likely to increase the systemic risk rather than decrease it. What's your take on this?
In the next crisis, the Bank of England will have to use AI to run scenarios on how to do liquidity injections or some other reactions. That's inevitable. The way to think about the systemic risk from AI is as we build in trust, as we see it performing increasingly well in increasingly complex situations, we get the AI version of the Peter principle when it gets promoted one level above its ability. But you will not know that until you're already in a crisis, at which time you can't turn it off.
After people lose money in the equity markets, they get frozen, they do nothing, they are unable to move. They will not allocate to hedge funds, which would diversify their portfolios. They would basically nothing. They just sit tight and wait.
So study after study around the world has shown that most people in retirement actually have a declining standard of living, right? I get a statement today that says I have $300,000 in my pension account. I have no clue what that guarantees me in retirement. So it's a completely useless piece of information, but unless you have good regulation, there's no incentive for my vendor to change, right? So at the highest level, that's where they put the boundary and say the only goal is funded status of all pensions, DB, DC, everybody.
The next generation will not only inherit a lot of wealth from wealthy parents, but of course will be in the auto-enrollment systems and will have started, I think, psychologically understanding that you have to start making some provision much earlier on in your career. But I think there is a mid-generational problem of people who simply haven't and can't now make enough provision.
Yeah, they don't have an incentive to do so.
It's too late to introduce some sort of tax incentive. And it is, of course, a function of the political system. It is a very easy issue, actually, to hide, because you're off to the next election and it is always somebody else's problem. And it seems to me all the efforts to design effective macroprudential regulation will fall on the fact that, you know, the markets are so democratized now that people expect somebody else to pick up the mistakes.
One of my LSE colleagues, he's been looking at this and he says that bailout is a middle-class good.
Did I hear you correctly that practically you suggested that there is a possibility of systemic risk events coming out of multi-strategy funds?
I think there is, and I think that we saw that in March 2020. I mean, you could take the other side of that and say their trading is so large that the central banks would always have to bail out these trades in those types of scenarios, and that's effectively what we saw in COVID. But I suppose my point is we don't know, because the landscape in terms of their assets has shifted so quickly that it would be in the back of my mind as a possible risk.
The stock market itself is a highly questionable thing as far as its social value. I think it's actually the single greatest accelerant of the demise of humanity because of the incentives that it creates for companies, the companies who are listing and listed on those exchanges. So a CEO and a board are compensated not by how much good did they do in the world, but by how much profit did they make, how fast is it growing, and can we make it grow even faster? It's the second derivative. And so you can only either push more product or cut more cost, which is what incentivizes behavior like offshoring production to a place that has no regulations for human safety, no regulations for environmental safety. You end up with lead in your children's toys. You end up with rivers and lakes and oceans polluted. You end up with microplastics in everything. And it's literally all down to that. It's not good enough to make money as a company. The rate at which you're making money has to keep going up. Otherwise, your stock price goes down. It's insanity.
From my experience, having been part of a fund of hedge funds and now working with clients on an advisory basis, you kind of get to observe the decision-making process. And we're all subject to the behavioral biases when we're investing, but it's just easier to observe them in other people than in yourself.
When you find yourself, for example, talking to a successful entrepreneur who sold their business, these people have a massive appetite for risk, something that would, be considered irresponsible in financial markets. So what they did in practice is betting on one idea for all of their life with all of their money, putting their families at risk behind one idea and one person. And then some guy from the financial world comes up and says, you should be diversifying your bets. You should be happy with, 6% long-term return. Some people don't understand.
There's sort of two major competitions. One makes a lot of sense, right? One is geopolitical competition for influence, competition for access, for political allies. And that makes sense for the U.S. to be very concerned about the rise of China. It makes sense for the U.S. to be very concerned about where it's losing influence, right? Because that influence is worth a lot of money. And there's the other aspect, which is sort of economic competition, which makes no sense at all, right? Because the U.S. has never competed with China economically, right? They're in a value chain, right? They're in a marriage in a way, right? Like, U.S. needs cheap import from China. That trade has benefited the U.S. tremendously. And to try to make that into a competition as U.S. would really like to take back, low-cost manufacturing because, boy, we just got a lot of unemployed workers. Right? That's insane, right? The U.S. has record low unemployment, right? We can't afford to have people to go do low-cost manufacturing.
And you are saying that from your NLP models, the invasion was looking likely.
If you have a net that is effectively taking in all of the Russian news and can show you and quantify how systematically these narratives are trending and really are being systematically pushed out in all of the news. So now you're thinking in a multi-dimensional space. That definitely gets your alarm bells ringing.